The inventory listed the long gallery, the east wing, the stables, the kitchen gardens, and the debts. Reginald Holt, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, read the last line twice. Then he set the document down and looked out the window at the drive, where his solicitor's carriage was still waiting in the rain. He had not expected the girl. Nobody had mentioned the girl. Dorothea Sable had been at Ashenmere for 11 years. She had arrived at 7, brought by her mother's lady's maid on the morning her mother died, and she had stayed because no one had thought to send her away. The previous Earl, her mother's cousin, and a man who found sentiment more inconvenient than cruelty, had simply absorbed her into the household, not as family, never as family, as a fixture, like the leak in the east corridor or the broken latch on the library door, something to be worked around. She answered to the housekeeper, she assisted with the linens and the candles, and, in the years since Mrs. Oakes had gone deaf in her left ear with the receiving of deliveries. She wore gray. She kept her hair pinned. She did not eat at the family table, and she had not been introduced to anyone in 11 years. When the Earl died in February, quietly, in his sleep, without a will that anyone could find, Dorothea had thought, now it comes. Now someone would look at the ledgers and notice her name. Now someone would open the cedar chest in the old study, the one she had never touched, and find what was inside, but no one did. Instead, a solicitor arrived from London with a buyer for the estate, and the staff were given 1 month's wages, and the furniture was catalogued, and Dorothea stood in the kitchen corridor and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she had been forgotten so completely she had not even made it onto the list of things to be disposed of. She packed a single owl bag. She told Mrs. Harlow, the new housekeeper brought in from an agency for the transition, that she was the upstairs housemaid and had been so for 3 years. Mrs. Harlow wrote it down without looking up. Reginald Holt arrived on the 14th of April, which was a Tuesday and raining, as every day in that part of Northumberland seemed to be raining when something significant happened. Dorothea watched from the landing window as the carriages came up the drive, 2 of them, and a cart behind with trunks, and she pressed herself to the side of the curtain and watched. He was younger than she had expected. The solicitor's letter had said the Earl of Dunmore, and she had pictured someone like her mother's cousin, gray, satisfied, indifferent to weather and to other people. This man stepped out of the carriage and immediately looked up at the house, the way people did when they were measuring something. Not admiring. Measuring. He was perhaps 30. He had the kind of face that seemed made for difficult decisions. Dorothea went back to the linen room and finished counting sheets. The first time he spoke to her directly, it was about a window. She had been in the east corridor, reattaching a curtain rod that had come loose from the plaster. It had been loose for 6 years, and apparently now that the house had a new owner, someone was meant to fix it, when she heard him behind her. "The latch is broken," he said. She turned. He was looking at the window she'd just pushed shut. "Yes, my lord," she said. "It's been so for some time. I can have Mr. Aldridge's replacement look at it." He looked at her then in the particular way he had, not rude, but direct in a manner she wasn't accustomed to from men of his position. Most of them looked through the help. He looked at her. "You've been here long?" "Some years, my lord, and you know the house." It was not quite a question. "Well enough," she said. He nodded and walked on, and Dorothea turned back to the curtain rod and found that her hands had gone slightly unsteady, which she put down to the cold. She did not mean to stay. That is the thing she returned to later, when she tried to explain it, to herself mostly, since there was no one else to explain it to. She had planned to leave. She had planned to write to her father's solicitor in Edinburgh, a man named Mr. Fenwick, who had sent her a letter 4 years ago that she had not answered because answering it would have required her to exist officially in a world that had decided to forget she existed. She had meant to write. She meant to every week. Instead, she counted the linen and mended the curtains and watched the new Earl learn the estate. He was not what she had expected. That was the difficulty. The previous Earl had owned Ashenmere the way he owned his pocket watch, as an object, as a thing to be checked occasionally and wound. Reginald Holt walked the fields in the rain. He spoke to the tenants directly, which none of them seemed ready for. He asked questions about the drainage and the old mill and the beech grove on the north end, and he listened when people answered, which was, Dorothea had to concede. Not nothing. She watched him from a careful distance. It was easier to understand someone when they didn't know you were watching. The cedar chest. She had known, all along, it would come down to the cedar chest. It was in the old study, her father's study, though no one called it that anymore, had not called it that in 11 years. When the previous Earl had moved in, he had looked at the room, found it satisfactory, and added his own papers to her father's without clearing anything out. This was not sentiment. It was indifference. He would not have noticed the difference between her father's correspondence and old seed catalogs. She had thought about removing the chest. She had thought about it many times, but she had never opened it, had been afraid to, in the way that you are afraid of things that might change everything. And so it sat there, under the window, and she walked past it twice a week when she aired the room, and she did not open it, and she did not move it, and eventually she stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing something that has become part of the shape of the air. Then, on a Thursday in late May, she went to air the study and found the Earl sitting at the desk with the chest open before him. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "Shut the door," he said. "Please." His voice, when he said what he said next, was careful. The way voices get careful when someone is trying to do something they have not done before and are not certain how. "There are letters here," he said. "Personal correspondence. The previous Earls, I assumed, but the handwriting changes. Some of them are signed by someone called Edward Sable." He paused. "The third Earl of Dunmore." "Yes," Dorothea said. "He died 11 years ago." "Yes." The Earl looked at her. She had the peculiar sensation of watching him work something out. "There is a letter here," he said slowly, "addressed to a daughter." She did not move. The window was gray with afternoon light, and the room smelled of old paper and the particular cold of rooms that are never quite warm enough, and Dorothea stood in the doorway and thought, "Here it is then." "Her name," he said, "is given as Dorothea." She told him all of it. She wasn't sure afterward why she had. She had kept the whole of it back for 11 years. From Mrs. Oakes and the agency housekeeper, and the new kitchen girl who asked too many questions. But when Reginald Holt looked at her across the desk, with her father's letter in his hand, she found there was nothing left to hold back with. Her father had been the third Earl of Dunmore. Ashenmere was his. When he died, too young, too fast, a fever in January that no one had expected. The title had passed to his cousin by the terms of an entail that was older than the house itself. Her mother was dead. There was no will because her father had been 32 and had not thought to write one. The new Earl, her mother's cousin, the cold, indifferent man, had arrived, surveyed the estate, and decided that a 7-year-old girl with no legal claim to anything was better absorbed quietly than acknowledged awkwardly. She had been here ever since. "You've been living in your own house," Reginald said, "as a housemaid." "As a housemaid's assistant originally," she said. "I was promoted." She did not mean it as humor, but something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "There was a letter," she said. "My father's letter. I've never opened it. I couldn't." She stopped. "I was afraid of what it might say, whether he'd known what would happen to me, whether he'd tried to arrange something and failed. I didn't want to know if he'd simply not thought of it." Reginald looked down at the envelope in his hands. "It's addressed to you," he said. "You should be the one to open it." She read it standing at the window because she could not sit. Her father had written it in the last week before he died, when the fever had come down enough for him to hold a pen. He had known by then that he was not going to recover. He had written to his solicitor, to the London bank, to 3 different men of law. And he had written to her, his daughter, who was 6 at the time of writing and would not be able to read it for years. He had known about the entail. He had known the title would pass to Edmund, his cousin whom he described with a brevity that said a great deal. He had arranged, or thought he had arranged, for a sum of money to be held separately for Dorothea. Not the estate, not the title, those were beyond his reach, but enough. Enough that she would not be dependent on the kindness of a man who had none. The arrangement had not held. She found out later, much later, that Edmund had known about the fund and had moved quickly, in those first months, to redirect it. By the time any of her father's letters had reached Mr. Fenwick in Edinburgh, the money was elsewhere, and Edmund was firmly in residence. And the solicitor had been gently persuaded that the matter was settled. She read the letter twice, standing at the window. Her father had thought of her. He had tried. He had failed. But he had tried, and he had written to her as though she were already grown, as though she were someone, and it was not nothing. It was not nothing. She folded the letter along its original creases and held it against her chest for a moment before she turned. Reginald was looking at the fire. He had given her the window deliberately. She understood that about him by now. He did things deliberately, with a consideration for other people's dignity that she had found, in the months of watching him, quietly remarkable. "My lord," she began. "You don't have to call me that," he said. "I think you've probably earned the right to at least my name." The difficulty, and there was a difficulty, because there always is, was a man named Harwick Crane. Harwick Crane was the son of the previous Earl's brother, which made him a cousin once removed of the estate's previous occupant, and not, as far as any solicitor had been able to determine, the heir to anything. But Harwick Crane was the sort of man who found legal inapplicability a minor inconvenience, and when the news reached him, through channels Dorothea could not identify, because she had not told anyone, that a young woman with a prior claim to Ashenmere had been found living in the house, he arrived at the front door on a rainy June afternoon, with 2 solicitors and an expression of great civic concern. Dorothea heard him from the corridor. He was saying that the sale of the estate was in question, that there were irregularities, that the matter of the 3rd Earl's daughter constituted a complication that necessitated. Here he used the word re-examination, which was a word that meant exactly what it sounded like. She stood in the corridor and listened, and she thought, he doesn't care about me. He never has. He cares about the estate. If the sale could be overturned, if the whole thing could be tangled in litigation long enough, there might be grounds for the question of the entail to come up again. And if the entail came up again, and if it could be argued that Edmund's occupation of the estate had been irregular, then perhaps someone with a more attenuated claim might find themselves with something. It was elaborate. It was also, she had to admit, not entirely stupid. She went into the study. Reginald was standing behind his desk. The 2 solicitors were seated. Harwick Crane was standing at the window, her window, the one she had watched the drive from on the day he arrived, looking out at the garden with the expression of a man who has already decided the outcome. He turned when she came in. "Miss Sable," he said in a voice that implied he was doing her a great favor by knowing her name. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I was just explaining to the Earl that your situation creates certain complications." "I heard," she said, "your claim to the estate." "I have no claim to the estate," Dorothea said. "The estate was sold. A sale is a sale. My father's entail was clear. I am a natural daughter of the 3rd Earl, which means I have a claim to his personal property, if any of it was not included in the sale, and to his name. That is all." There was a silence. Harwick Crane blinked. "The name," he said. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that my father recognized me in a letter written in the last week of his life, which is sufficient under Scottish law where his secondary properties were held, and that whatever else is in dispute, my parentage is not." She kept her voice even. She had rehearsed none of this. It was simply what she knew, what she had known for 11 years, while she counted linen and mended curtains, and waited for a moment that kept not arriving. "If you would like to contest that, Mr. Crane, you are welcome to try. But I would suggest you have a stronger case before you engage 2 solicitors and travel from wherever it is you've come from." Harwick Crane looked at Reginald. Reginald said nothing. He was watching Dorothea with an expression she could not read. "The sale of the estate," Harwick said, recovering, "may still be, is not in question," said Reginald. He said it quietly, in the voice she had heard him use with difficult tenants. "Final, reasonable, not open for discussion. The estate was sold through proper channels. Miss Sable has raised no objection. You have no standing. I'd like you and your solicitors to have a comfortable journey home." He asked her to stay. Not immediately. Not that afternoon. That afternoon was taken up with the departure of Harwick Crane and his solicitors, and then with a conversation with Reginald's own man the house, and proceeded to be very brisk and practical about the whole thing. She had a claim to her father's name. She had a claim to the money that Edmund had redirected, not easily proved, but not impossible. Mr. Fenwick in Edinburgh, when written to, turned out to have kept every letter, which was the habit of meticulous men, and, in this case, an extraordinary gift. She had a history. She had a name. She had, for the first time in 11 years, a past that existed in writing. It was in the evening, after dinner, which she had eaten in the kitchen out of sheer habit, and then found herself called to the drawing-room by a maid who seemed faintly embarrassed to be delivering the message, that Reginald asked her. He was standing at the fireplace. He turned when she came in. "Sit down," he said, "please." She sat. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how to say something. She had learned his silences by then. This one was careful. "You could leave," he said. "You have enough now, with your father's name and the Edinburgh money, when it's recovered, to establish yourself. There are options. I'll help you, whatever you decide." "I know," she said. "But," she looked at him, "but," he said carefully, "I would like it very much if you didn't." The fire crackled. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the last of the evening light was coming through the window at a lower angle, catching the dust on the mantelpiece and the edge of the curtain she had reattached in March. "My lord." Reginald. Reginald. She tried the name. It fit strangely, like wearing something that belonged to someone else, and then, in the same moment, fit exactly. "I've been in this house for 11 years. I know where the latch sticks and where the floor is soft and which chimney draws badly in a north wind." "I know," he said. "That's not why I'm asking." She looked at him, at his face, which was made for difficult decisions, and which was, in this moment, doing something she had not seen it do before. Something uncertain. Something that was not quite a question, because it was not yet brave enough to be a question. I know it's not," she said. They were married in September, quietly, in the village church, with Mrs. Harlow and the head groundskeeper as witnesses, and a small supper afterward in the dining room that Dorothea had been avoiding for 11 years, because it had always felt like someone else's room. Reginald's mother arrived 2 weeks later, from a house in Edinburgh, where she had apparently been receiving regular letters about the situation. She was small and sharp-eyed, and reminded Dorothea somewhat of a sparrow deciding whether to trust a new feeder. She toured the house with Dorothea, not with Reginald, with Dorothea, and she said things about The wallpaper and the draperies and the general state of the entrance hall that were critical in a way that was somehow not unkind. She stopped in the long gallery, in front of the portrait that had hung there for 30 years, Dorothea's father at 25, painted before his marriage, before the entail, before everything. "He has your eyes," Lady Holt said. "Yes," Dorothea said. Lady Holt looked at the portrait for a long time. "I imagine," she said finally, "you'll want to keep it there." "Yes," Dorothea said. Lady Holt nodded, once. Then she moved on to comment on the inadequacy of the east corridor lighting, and Dorothea followed her, and something settled in the house around them. Not loudly, not with any ceremony, just settled, the way houses do when they finally have the right people in them. The Edinburgh money was recovered by November. Mr. Fenwick, who turned out to be 72 and deeply pleased to have the matter resolved before he died, came down from Scotland himself to finalize the paperwork, and he brought with him a photograph of her father's signature that made Dorothea have to set it down and look at the window for a moment before she could continue. Edmund's estate, such as it was, had been sold 3 years before his death. There was not much, there was enough. Her father had thought of her. He had tried. He had not quite managed to protect her, had not known, in the fog of fever and borrowed time, that his arrangements would not hold. But he had tried, and the trying was its own kind of thing, its own weight, one she had been carrying wrong all these years and could now set down in the right place. She wrote to Mr. Fenwick to thank him. She wrote it at the desk in the old study, which was her study now, hers in the way a room becomes yours when you finally stop apologizing for existing in it. The cedar chest was still in the corner. She left it there. There was, she thought, no reason to move it. That winter, Reginald found her in the long gallery one evening, standing in front of her father's portrait with a candle. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She heard him. She had always been good at hearing who was in a room. And then he came and stood beside her. They were quiet for a while. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said when Harwick Crane came." "Which part?" "That your father's recognition of you was sufficient. That your parentage was not in question." He looked at the portrait. "You said it as though you'd known it for years." "I had," she said. "I just hadn't had occasion to say it out loud." He was quiet again. "You were always the Earl's daughter," he said. "The whole time, she agreed. The candle moved in a draft from somewhere, the east corridor window probably, still not quite right, despite 3 attempts at the latch, and the portrait seemed for a moment to flicker into something warmer than oil paint. Her father at 25, before everything, looking out at a room that was now, finally, occupied by the right people. Ashenmere stood as it had always stood. She read the 12 pages again that night, in bed, with the fire banked low. And this time, she was not afraid of what they said.